Hi, I hope this has become a habit for you. It is Thursday at 5:30 Pacific time. I'm Evelyn Jerome Alexander with Magellan College Counseling. I'm here in Los Angeles, and we have 12 counselors who help students all over the country go through their college search and application process. I should start saying maintain their sanity through their college search and application process. I actually got a thank you note from a parent last fall whose son applied early decision and got in somewhere. And she sent me a thank you note and said, thank you for helping us save our family and save our sanity this fall. So that was a lovely way to really put a label on what we actually do. But I'm thrilled to welcome in my third installation of these live streams, Libby Browne, who is Regional Assistant
but it doesn't really matter.
Associate Director of Admissions with the University of Rochester. And Libby is the perfect person to talk about what test optional really means. And the reason I say that is she's at the University of Rochester, which is a medium-sized, highly ranked, highly selective, we'll talk about that in a minute, research university whose former dean of admission, or maybe his title was vice president or something, is now at Cornell University. So this is a legit school. A lot of West Coasters haven't heard of the University of Rochester, so we're gonna let her plug it a little bit and tell you a little bit about it. But before she was at Rochester, she worked at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So the two schools could not be more different when it comes to the way they admit students. And I really want people to understand what test optional means, why colleges make that choice, what they're trying to do, who they're looking for, how they're looking at students. So Libby has lots to say about this. Let Libby go for a few minutes on what test optional means, help us understand, because I feel like the biggest barrier to people understanding why colleges or how colleges make decisions when they're test optional is people are conditioned to think that the higher your test score, the smarter you are. And it's a piece of evidence that tells you, the person at the college who's reading my application, how smart I am. So tell us how this all works and how you can make decisions if I don't get to tell you how smart I am.
So I would frame this as the important piece of the puzzle for a lot of families and students is that the majority of selective admissions all the way to less selective admissions still use what we refer to as a holistic approach. The holistic review is intended to get a broad picture beyond just what the test scores or the GPA are indicating in terms of quote unquote academic readiness, right? Especially as it relates to test optional. There's a lot of evidence that there are some disconnects in terms of the way that it may be offered or the volume of times that it's offered or whatever it might be. So it doesn't necessarily always correlate to a consistent standardized approach to the actual application process. And certainly for our students, there is an important, I don't know if you would call it a soapbox that I like to get up on, but it's true. The test was designed to be an indicator of college readiness. An aptitude or a scholastic achievement that was designed to be a recognizable number range that students will indicate their readiness for college. It was never an intelligence test. It was never designed to be a test to indicate your capacity to be successful in life. It was designed to be a measurement to allow us as a profession to use a more standardized approach in this process. However, as we've gone over the years, as we've gone over the decades, there's a lot of evidence that there are very particular portions of the communities that we are working with that in an equity-based model you would be outreaching to and working with that consistently score differently than other populations and other communities. And particularly for a lot of students, if you are, in a position to be well prepared for these tests, yeah, that may or may not be reflective in the actual score that you receive. However, you having the standardized taken out of standardized now need a lot of different tools and a toolkit to review students that may not be falling in these categories that we're referring to. And particularly for selective admissions processes, there was a lot of fundamental evidence that something like your academic achievement as it relates to the kinds of classes that you've been taking, your capacity within those classes to be successful, and the work that you've been doing, again, the basic toolkit of time management, or dedicating to a particular area within the curriculum, your strengths, those are things that aren't always measured in the same way that they should be by a standardized test. And especially for a lot of students, being able to offer alternative pathways to share that information about themselves, their ability to share to the, the applications that they're applying, the schools that they're applying to, that this is going to be something that we want to frame in a different way. We want to be able to offer an alternative to those students if they feel like their scores are not reflective of their capacity to be successful here. And I think that ability to cater to the process and recognize, okay, what are the things that I am really good at? Maybe you are good at communicating, and that is a part of why you've been successful in your coursework, but there's no place in the application to indicate that you're a strong communicator. So maybe there's an alternative. Maybe an interview is a great way to do that. Same thing with students that are extraordinarily strong in standardized testing. We don't want to minimize the ability for a student to feel like they were successful in a part of the process. We just want to level the playing field and allow students to be able to share themselves and their experiences in a much more nuanced way than just a GPA and a test score would be able to provide us. And I think that that's the foundation of test optional.
Okay, that's a good basis for everyone to start with. So there are colleges who have been test optional for a long time. Your institution happens to be one of them. There are colleges who have been letting us know over the course of the last maybe 2 years that they were moving in this direction. But now, because of COVID and the weird situation that we're in, we have seen a rush of colleges announce that they are just going to go test optional for the next class, for the class of 2021. Talk to us a little bit about the difference, the philosophies, what the future might look like for maybe the newer schools that are new to the party.
Absolutely, especially for test optional. I think that there's a number of great examples that have either always been test optional, or at least it feels that way, or they've always had a sort of benchmark that says, testing is accessible. We would, encourage you if you feel like this is a good representation, but we want to be able to emphasize the holistic review in general. And I think for especially a lot of schools that have that attitude of the holistic review, there are a number of things that we tend to prioritize as part of that review process. Obviously, with a school that emphasizes rigor and academic achievement, and especially research-oriented communities where creation of new knowledge is a very valuable piece to that process, encouraging students to allow them to embrace other areas of that learning model is an important one, particularly for a lot of students in the United States. Research doesn't necessarily always happen in the high school environment. It does in maybe like a classroom or a lab, but it's not necessarily always as emphasized. And certainly we do see a volume of students that are pursuing their passions or their interests through outside methods, whether that be building a computer in their garage, or seeking medical volunteer work because they want to be going towards a pre-med experience, or they are joining a conservatory experience and they're moving towards more of a creative art capacity. And I think that the important thing with any test optional school, Evelyn mentioned obviously Boulder previous to that, but even before that I was working at an art school. And I'll be honest, we never once cared about your standardized tests at an art school. It was all about the foundation work that you were transitioning into, and your capacity to show that through a portfolio and through an audition process, and those sorts of things were much more valued in that delivery of information to us in that broader understanding of the student's experience. So when it comes to the test optional approach, I think that many schools, like I mentioned at the beginning, do value the holistic review and incorporate standardized testing in a piece of that conversation. When it comes to the transition or the switch that we're seeing now of schools are seeing the inability for students to be able to take tests. Therefore, is it a valuable or a valued experience for the student to then include that as part of their process? I've seen a number of messages. I've seen a number of messages from various institutions that indicate if you are planning to take it multiple times, but you didn't yet, we're still reviewing it, and yet we're, understanding that you may not have been able to give your best foot forward. I think the logic and the capacity for those communities and the reasoning, the idea behind why they're asking for standardized testing in the first place is one that's based in equity and is one that's based in the broader picture of, we want to be able to offer the best opportunity for these students to successfully transition onto our campus, to show that they're going to be a productive member of this community, that they're going to be transitioning into an environment that they're ready for. But again, the logic behind that when it relates to testing is somewhat minimized either way. And certainly you do see that in the volume of schools that have moved away from, say, subject tests or, going into more, let's say, a test flexible model, which allows you to bypass an SAT or an ACT score in lieu of something like an IB predicted score or an AP exam or subject tests that are more oriented towards that particular area of the curriculum that you're excited about. I think for a lot of schools, the important thing to remember is, and we can certainly get into this, the nuances of how you actually submit in just a minute, but the important thing is, if you are going test optional, the idea, the intent behind it is that you are crafting the application without testing, and that still requires you to maintain a lot of information and provide a lot of information to us in the application itself. It puts a lot more, let's say, pressure, but certainly a lot more value into the information that you are sharing with us. And what does that information tell us? That's an important thing to reflect on. That's an important thing to allow us to be able to understand. But again, it depends on the institution. What that institution is saying to you is, I want you to still craft an application and be intentional with that application and give us as much as you possibly can, or as much as we're asking you to, an important difference, to be able to share that aspect of yourself. But again, the value of the testing in either scenario, if you have it, you have it. If you don't, you don't. And that still needs to be, again, a bigger picture of how you're crafting the message that you are to those individual schools. If you are sending tests to a school that says, don't bother, we don't need them, we're still able to see that information. We're still able to have an unconscious bias towards that information. If you're not sending it entirely and you're avoiding that conversation at all, I'm still reviewing your essays and your letters of recommendation and your interview and your demonstrated interest in other ways. How are you connecting with us and learning about our community? Those pieces are still relevant to me either way. And I think for a lot of the reading process, that is, again, the core hasn't changed. It's just some of the nuances and subtleties around it that, reflect slightly differently depending on the individual and what they're including to us. Yeah.
Okay, you touched on a couple of important points that I want to follow up. The first one is another assumption that people who are parent age, when I applied to college, we were looking at well-rounded. That's what colleges were telling us they wanted. And I know from having worked with students for 10 years that that's not necessarily what you're asking for, but parents still have that assumption. So I feel like, another shift we have to make is, and you said it, you're looking for evidence that they're going to succeed in college and some type of evidence that they've pursued a passion. And I know we overuse that word. It doesn't have to be a passion. You don't have to cure cancer, but you have to pursue some interest to a deep level, as opposed to what we used to call well-rounded, which was, I'm on student government and I play a sport and I work at my synagogue. That's all great, but tell me what it is that you really care about and what you're spending your time doing.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of families and students, it is a very tough thing to navigate the waters of you're changing and growing as a human being at the age of 13, your interests may be very different, 13, 14, 15, than they are at 16, 17, and 18 and beyond. And I think the important thing for a lot of families and students to remember is that we aren't looking for, again, that cure for cancer. No, we do not anticipate, even in the most highly selective processes. Yes, we do see students who are doing incredible things with their lives, but not every single student is doing the same incredible thing with their lives in the same way. And especially as it relates to the crafting of your application, if there are things or barriers that may have prevented you from being able to explore something more deeply. Let's say, for example, you had an entire summer planned out for this summer and all of a sudden your plans fall through. That doesn't diminish your ability to be successful and your ability to allow us insight into what those passions are. Just because it's not on your resume doesn't mean that it won't be or can't be. And I think for a lot of students, the idea of being perfect in this process is a fallacy, and certainly something that I'm always like, well, if you're perfect, why are you going to college to learn, right? It is an important piece of the puzzle for us to see that you have the tools to be successful, that you understand the value of time management, that you understand the value of embracing a variety of different things, a variety of different people, that you are going to be entering into a community that is extraordinarily diverse, that has a lot of different perspectives, that you're able to accommodate that and work with that and grow with that. But again, when going back to the conversation of testing, do I see that through the standardized testing process? I don't know. And I think that a lot of the bigger conversations that we have around test optional is that the qualities and the experiences of the student are not always reflected in that 4-hour period on a Saturday. They're often more reflected in the day-to-day operating experiences that you have, and the experiences of your community and your experience of how you want to shape your experience moving forward. That is all very, very, very relevant to us in a way that something like testing may not always be able to indicate to us.
Well, and here's an interesting question. The Common Application just announced, I think this week, a couple days ago, that they have a separate question that basically says, life sometimes throws a curveball at you. Yeah, and it's not one of the main essay questions. It's a separate question, and you get a choice. You can say, do you want to tell us how your life was impacted by COVID? Yes or no? And you can say no. And if you say yes, you get a little box, and it's 250 words. It's a tiny little paragraph.
Just like an additional information section. Yep.
Well, right. So the question is this a place, Libby, for kids who really have experienced hardship through this situation? Or you just mentioned, what if you had an amazing summer planned and everything got canceled and you were, planning on learning XYZ? How would you feel about reading that essay about, here was why I was disappointed, but here's what I did instead?
Yeah, I think there's a level that it's individual in the way that it's designed, right? The intention behind the Common Application is that it's as broad a sort of brushstroke as it possibly can be, and then each individual student is going to paint it differently, right? And so when you're working with a question like that, there is an implication that you should be doing something. And I don't want to minimize the fact that if a student is extraordinarily impacted by this, whether they have been directly impacted health-wise or their family's been directly impacted by this health-wise, or economically, financially within the family structure, somebody's lost a job, somebody has cut out, whatever it might be, that is a stressor that we don't expect you to be immediately, well, I went and I cured cancer. It's no. We understand that is a variable that we want to be able to incorporate. That being said, are students in a different position in different parts of their lives where they are able to respond to this in a different way? Absolutely. And I think as we continue through this process, obviously the first 2 months of this, everyone was sort of like, oh yeah, we'll wait until May and then things will start to, well, we're starting to see that that's not necessarily the case for all people. And so we are anticipating that there will be continued disruptions, that there will be continued issues down the line. And that is a great question to maybe address later in the process. I know a lot of students, initially when the application comes out in August, they're ready and I'm excited to do this. I'm going to start writing my essays. I'm going to start putting things in together and all of this. Sometimes you need that extra space to reflect and say, what have I learned from this? What am I doing with my experience to do the best that I can, but also try something new and try something different. I think that the expectation is going to be very individual, and the context of that question is going to be very much based in the individual's experience, but it does, it is helpful that there is going to be a very specific section. It opens up the rest of the application. One of my deepest fears is that hundreds of personal essays will be about how this impact, disrupted everything, or that they were able to learn all these different things. I would like for us to be as focused in that conversation around COVID as much as possible in that section. And then the rest of the application still embraces all of the other things that you define that you are, seeing as valuable and important to you. I think that is the biggest important piece of the puzzle as we move forward. But you never know. I certainly expect a large volume of students to have an extraordinary amount of disruption in their activities as it relates to junior into senior year. So, it's inevitable, but I do hope that most students will acknowledge that the potential for their ability to get involved in something does not minimize our understanding that we see that, we hear you, we want to understand that, we want to see that on our campus, and that's not going to be a preventative element to their application.
Another point that I think people don't think about a lot, and what you said was, if you tell us what your test scores are, we can't unsee that. And so I think it's important for people to understand there's many ways to transmit test scores to a college, right? We sit with our clients and through ACT and through College Board, we show them and help them send their scores, right? That's the official way to do it. But there's a lot of schools that put scores on transcripts, and there's a reason for that. There are a lot of students who want to self-report their scores, which the Common Application now allows you to self-report your scores. The problem is, if you choose to self-report your scores within your Common Application, when Rochester says, would you like us to consider your scores? Because you're test optional, but that means we have the option of giving you our scores. If I say, no, I don't want you to consider my scores, but I put my scores in the score reporting section, you still see them, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, what is designed to be throughout the process is a student crafts their application in the way that they want us to see it, and then we see it, right? That's the ideal, that is the circumstances, whether that is inclusive of test scores or not. The idea is that you craft this big picture and send it off, and that we see whatever that big picture actually is supposed to be. Well, yeah, human error, and certainly as it relates to the experience of why students may have that test score on their transcripts, or why they might have that test score listed in their Common Application. A lot of that has to do with finances. It is expensive to send scores and to expect students to have that 10 school list. Every single one of them gets however much to spend to send those scores in the first place. Right. It is a huge investment. And I think for a lot of schools, the logic behind self-reporting allows us to say, you don't have to do this right now. If you enroll with us, yes, we definitely want to see these final scores. We want to verify that information, but we don't want to necessarily put you out of house and home and as a part of that process. And necessarily, we never want to put students out of house and home. Let me clarify that. So especially for the logic of it, in Rochester's case, when we're looking at an application and they accidentally, for lack of a better term, include their scores, we block it out, right? Like we do not consider that in our conversations. Do those moments of like, oh, it happened? Yeah. And I think the important thing in that case is to recognize your unconscious bias as it relates to those test scores, to acknowledge that you have seen them in your head, and then immediately wipe them away and say, no, focus on all of this other stuff. And I think that that's an important difference between some schools that are test optional, where it is part of the process to recognize the student's choice to include that, versus a more traditional model, I guess is the best way to put it, of saying like your test scores and your GPA, those are the two that you look at first, and then you dig into the model of holistic review. For a lot of schools, they again base a lot of their processes on test scores. If you are applying to a community and you are being made eligible for a merit scholarship, a lot of that is indexed based on your test score and GPA.
Yep.
Or, there's some nuances associated with that, but there's the inability to divorce your brain from that experience where you say, I have to have these test scores in order to then move forward with this experience. And I think for a lot of students and families, it becomes extraordinarily convoluted if you're applying to many schools that have different policies. And in my opinion, I think the best policy is maintaining a close relationship with that school as much as possible. I know that many schools do not have that kind of flexibility or accommodation of being able to say that I am your admissions counselor, email me, call me if you have questions, if you have concerns. There was a mistake or anything like that, let us know. Many schools don't have that kind of flexibility, but I do think that particularly for a lot of families and students, being able to recognize that that intentionality is still there, it's still present, and we want to honor that as much as possible either way, that your projection out of yourself is the one that we want to be seeing.
Do you make any assumptions if a student chooses not to submit? AP, if you see AP Bio, AP Physics on the transcript and no AP scores, do you make any assumptions?
I don't necessarily make assumptions. It's the concern that sometimes, and we talked about this earlier last week too, sometimes you see a student that is indicating that they do not want to have their test scores reviewed, and yet an AP score that is very concerning is listed on their transcripts. And the rest of the transcript is extraordinary. It is a very strong transcript. It is not reflective of those scores. The important thing is that at any point in the process, if there is a question raised in the application, you want to be able to answer it essentially in that process as much as possible. You never want someone like me to then go, wait a minute, what's going on? And that's, again, not to minimize the fact that, yeah, AP exams, like we are seeing this week, it is not a necessarily easy thing to manage. The reflective experience of your, overall picture of that AP class, we're looking at those grades, we're looking at the fact that you took the AP class and presented yourself with more rigor. But at the same time, if you are ultimately at the end of that process not reflecting the competency that the AP score, quote unquote, reflects, then that starts to beg the question of, okay, what's going on here? And we're able to sometimes contextualize that, especially for students that might have either something like this, where there's just a complete disruption of the experience. Certainly in California, we see a lot of the wildfires being a huge impact to the students' experiences, whether it be in their home environment or otherwise. Or we do see also, a health scare or something happened at home. Your mother being diagnosed with something is definitely going to impact your ability to be able to focus in a class or in a testing environment. And we want to be able to understand that. And that's not to minimize, again, that these test scores are not a good reflection, because a lot of the time they are a good reflection of your competency within that particular subject matter, but it's not always the case. And I think that that's the important thing with test option or like test flexible policies, is that is not always a good indicator. And that's the important thing. If it's not always a good indicator for a standardized process, it may not be the best usage of our time in understanding and reflecting upon your experiences.
If we self-report, okay, this is what I always tell my clients. AP scores have to, I generally tell students not to send AP scores, almost never.
We don't typically see them. Yeah.
You don't require them, right? Nobody requires them. You have to send them in a bundle, right? You can't send one score. However, now that we have self-reporting, you can self-report just one. So what if I got a 5 on the AP Physics? I got 1s and 2s on everything else, but what if I just self-report that one? Are you going to make any assumptions about everything else? Why I'm only reporting that one?
I think there is a natural human tendency to make assumptions. I think that we are regularly training ourselves to move away from those assumptions, especially as it relates to the reading of applications. Every year and every selective process or otherwise that I've been a part of, there has been a very intensive training, a reader training, a reflective training after we do the reading processes. What went well, what didn't go well, what were some of the struggles that we had. And at any point in that, we always have a training on unconscious bias and the inability to make assumptions about something given this information. If I am seeing this information, you are presenting this information, I cannot make assumptions for everything else that's going on. I can ask questions about maybe what's going on otherwise, but this information is what is being shown to me, and that is what I have to base it on. Yeah. Whether we receive additional information that contextualizes that outside of what you are presenting, I'm thinking of specifically letters of recommendation, where sometimes a student will not be able to fully relate or, particularly for difficult circumstances in their life, a lot of the time they're not able to really speak to that in a meaningful way in their application, or they're not sure how to relay that information in a way that makes sense to them. So they tend to rely very heavily on the letters of recommendation at that point. We rely on those to give a lot of context and ability for us to, again, understand that bigger picture of the student. But we are only able to, again, make decisions based on the information presented to us. And we can certainly ask questions and dig further if necessary, but we're not in the position to, deep dive on everyone's Facebooks or something like that, where all of a sudden there's a post that I did terribly in my AP, and all of a sudden we're like, oh, there's no more truth in this. We come from a place of understanding that you are being honest and forthright in your experiences, that you're not actively trying to pull the wool over our eyes in any way, shape, or form, that you are accurately representing yourself, but that you are accurately representing your best self. And if that is sometimes the case where we're not seeing that, it can sometimes show up in other areas of the application. I often find that a student that is maybe not well organized, someone that may have rushed through the process, there's small indicators in the application otherwise that indicate to me that there's maybe a disconnect in the bigger process. Why that is depends on the individual again. And that's why we do a deep dive in all of these processes to understand our students as best we are able. But sometimes, that does tend to raise some questions. But I give a lot of benefit of the doubt for students. And I think that that's an important thing. I'm a human, we're all humans. Being as open to this process and keeping this as much of a two-way street as possible is the important thing to me. Because I want a student on our campus that understands what they're getting themselves into, that they know what we are, who we are, and how they're going to be successful on our campus, as much as, I want a student to, be honest and forthright in the application too.
This goes to really doing the research to find the colleges where you are a good fit and that are a good fit for you. And
absolutely,
we didn't talk about that. And 2 weeks from now, I have 2 guests, one of whom is Chuck Lydiard from the University of Delaware, and one of whom invented the Corsava card sort.
Yay!
Which is a great program that we use with our students to help them prioritize what they're looking for in their college experience. So we're going to talk about how to build that list of colleges that are really a good fit for you. But if you do that, what you'll end up doing successfully is creating an application for Libby to read that really speaks to her and will say to her, this student will really succeed at the University of Rochester. If you're just making a list and throwing applications out there like spaghetti, you're not necessarily going to succeed at convincing the person who's making the decision that I'm a good fit for your campus.
A lot of the students that we see, particularly as it relates to Rochester, the curriculum is very unique in the landscape of higher education. It's, only a few schools offer what we call an open curriculum or a, flexible curriculum, we look for
Yeah.
students that are really intensely excited about particular areas and really, looking forward to diving very deeply into those areas. But we're also looking for students that don't know what they want and have a lot
Right.
of passions in a lot of different areas and don't know how to combine all those passions in a more traditional model. So that, again, when you're talking about like why Rochester in some of the areas of the application, the supplements or the interview or whatever, a lot of that time that's the connection that we're looking for is, okay, that we're, a community in upstate New York, you're looking for the East Coast, cool. You're looking for a smaller liberal arts sort of model in terms of the classroom structure. Okay, great. That describes a lot of schools. So where are those pinpoints that you are starting to see, oh, that's exciting, that's interesting, I connect with that? That's what we are talking about when we're saying a self-reflection and an introspection in the application process. We're not looking for you to just broad brush us either, and we don't want to do that to you. So in terms of that connection, a student that has really unique interests or really broad-based interests, all of those students are going to be successful in the context of the Rochester curriculum. But what are the other pieces? How are you, navigating this process with intention to understand what that next step might look like, but also what makes you happy, what makes you excited, what makes you feel powerful and impassioned. And, we want to empower you. We don't want to minimize you in this process. And I think for a lot of students, that gatekeeper role feels very intimidating. And
Yes.
We're not gatekeepers. We're two-way streets. The moment that, you submit your application, yeah, the ball is in my court, but then I put the ball right back into your court when I give you an admission. So then all of a sudden you have this list, this wonderful list of schools that all of whom maybe have accepted you, and now you have to make that decision. And I think that that's, again, part of the process is to choose the schools that see you, to choose the schools that understand you and want you on their campus. As much as any other. Yeah.
And I hope that that's exactly right. And I will post below this video a link to a little video I did a couple of years ago on how to research a college online. Literally the first place to go, maybe it's the second place. The first place is the fast facts about us. You need to know something about the college you're researching, but the next place you need to go is, what's the mission statement? What is this college putting itself out there to accomplish? And I always tell my students, it's really hard because you're right, you are the gatekeeper, you're gonna tell them if they're in or not. And so they keep thinking about you as, what am I going to get if I go to this college? But I try to say to them, turn it around. What are you going to offer to that campus community? Because I think that's what you, when you're reading those applications, are really looking for. How is this student going to contribute to our community?
And that potential, and it's about potential, but it's also about tying in the experiences that you've had and understanding that. And once again, I think that all of this conversation tends to justify the logic behind a test optional experience, because once again, testing doesn't always indicate that. And in fact, I would say that a lot of the nuances that we're talking about, testing can't indicate that.
Exactly.
Those are pieces of the puzzle that certainly fall out of place for plenty of students. And my heart breaks for students that feel like their test scores diminish their potential. I never want a student to feel like they are less than after taking a test. I want them to feel empowered to move forward in the direction that they're going to be, their best selves. And I think that is an important variable that we are all, as part of the admissions process, looking for, but how we go about doing that is always a little bit different too.
And so here's the bottom line. If you're fortunate enough to be a good tester, if you're fortunate enough to be able to afford test prep, if you're fortunate enough to have scored highly on exams, you should submit them, right? You should submit your scores if they're good, if they're within the range of the colleges that you're looking at. The range for Rochester is going to be very different than the range for Lewis and Clark, right? So, which is also test optional. So this is where doing the research comes in. But in the end, if you do submit your test scores to a test optional school or not to a test option or to a required school, testing is one small data point in a very large bucket of information that they're trying to collect on you to decide, again, if you are going to contribute to their community. We neglected to mention an important piece of information that you and I know because we talk to each other regularly, but what we didn't say was Libby actually lives in California.
Oh yeah,
so,
hey.
I mean,
I'm regional.
Right, but, so the reason that that's important is it indicates that, I mean, her 100% full-time job is to meet California high school students and talk to them and introduce them to the University of Rochester. It indicates that Rochester has made an investment in California. And I think that's even more important now, because whatever the fallout from what we're experiencing looks like, it's entirely possible that California families will want to have their kids stay closer to home. It's entirely possible that our UCs, our Cal States, our community colleges will be fuller than they've ever been. And to me and to our team, it's really important that you understand how many more choices there are out there. California has about 200 colleges, like 210, 230 colleges. There's 2,200 across the country. It's entirely possible that a year from now that number will be different, but for right now today, there's 2,200. So we're about 10% of what's available out there. So, and you know, other states have the same problem. When a family comes to us and says, we really want to stay here because it's cheaper. It may be cheaper on paper. It may be a lot of things. It's certainly closer to home, but it's not, you're not exploring the full breadth of opportunities out there. So I'd love for you to take advantage of people like Libby, and there's a couple, you know, there's over 100 people and over 100 colleges in California, but there's regional admissions folks all over the country, again, whose universities have invested in sending them to other states to educate those students about their colleges that are in a different area.
And I think for a lot of the value of being in this community, number one, I was born and raised in Rochester, so living and breathing and working in that community is something that is very second nature to me. But it's now second nature to be also working and breathing and living in and amongst the students and the families that I work with, and being able to understand the concerns or the broader context for what they're experiencing is a very important thing to me. And certainly it's a very important thing to the university as part of the bigger picture. I work very closely with our alumni community out here. I work very closely with you know, the management of this process, but also navigating these waters with students as part of the bigger, broader picture of college admissions as well. And I think the beautiful thing about having the regional model in the bigger picture is obviously it's very convenient for me to be living in Southern California and not having to trek back and forth 17 times during a year and work very closely with the families out here.
I think it actually snowed there this week, didn't it?
It did, yes. I was going to say, weather-wise, it's a little different as well. But we do also, particularly with the experience of the broader understanding of like the Rochester community, we have huge swaths of students that are coming from outside of not only the Northeast, but the United States as a whole too. And I think the important thing about recognizing the multicultural and diverse perspectives that you see on a day-to-day basis in a community like California, yeah, you know, the Northeast may have a lot of schools and opportunities and things, but they're also not unilaterally the same. Every school in Boston or every school in New York City or New York State is going to offer very different things. And being able to navigate these processes and have a wonderful college counseling center, you know, to center you and working with the Magellan team, I think is an important piece of the puzzle for a lot of students that I've worked with, at least, that individual attention is something that they're seeking in this process and may not be able to access as part of the broader spectrum or focus of the California community. I know that a lot of students that I work with don't get the kind of individual attention by nature of the school that they attend, and being able to foster these conversations is extremely important. So I'm glad also that you are doing more wonderful work as well, definitely. And obviously a wonderful sidekick as part of this process too.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. I think we actually you did a really good job of helping people see that the testing is just a piece of what you could look at, and if it's a piece that's missing, there's so many other ways for you to evaluate students and whether or not they are a good fit for Rochester. I really appreciate your time, Libby. It was lovely to see you again. And next week, I am really excited to be interviewing Lynn O'Shaughnessy, who is a national expert on college financial aid, on merit aid, on need aid. You will learn so much from spending hopefully half an hour to 45 minutes with her. So I hope you will join us again next week. Thank you everyone for watching. Please come back next week.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.